Of course, I read the Wall Street Journal, so I know all about it.
And December 12th is a special day for us, Cybersecurity Day. Like so many of the initiatives of the Boston Global Forum, it was the idea of and for those of you that have been involved in the Boston Global Forum, you know that this organization basically works around the core of it, and does the organizing, and so I'm very grateful, and grateful for this concept as well. I just want to introduce Mike Dukakis, who will be kind of the emceeing, moderating today, as he usually does. Mike is the head of the Boston Global Forum, three-time former governor of Massachusetts, 1988 Democratic presidential nominee, the envy of all of us in the academic world because he has half the year in Boston and he spends the other half at UCLA. And it's the winter summer field that we all long for. So, Mike.
John, thank you very much. Some of this does it a little bit. I'm going to make that meet my beloved Boston, New England for half a year, just 3 months. But it's the right 3 months. In the middle, if some of you expect are going through 60 final papers, getting a raise by next Monday. Those crazy weeks. But Kitty's birthday happens to be the day after Christmas. So we celebrate Christmas here with our son and his family, and then we head for either Denver or San Francisco, where our daughters happen to be with their family. This year it's going to be Denver, and we celebrate Kitty's birthday the day after Christmas. And a few days there, on the 29th, we head to Los Angeles. Providing UCLA is still there. I think it is. I've been getting 6 bulletins a day with the chancellor telling us when to be on the campus and not to be there. I'll start teaching right after the first year. I want you to think it's a restaurant. They do a full teaching schedule. It's really intense, but it's a lot of fun. And Los Angeles is kind of getting its act together these days. You know, I'm kind of a mass transportation fanatic, but good old Los Angeles, the car capital of the world, is now investing in billions in the railway transit system. And it's starting to work. It's transforming the city. And they're doing more than we are. It's a source of great frustration for me. The team needs some work. The bus got me over here today, but it was late, it was jammed. And I have to say to my colleagues here, look, let me tell you what they're doing in Los Angeles. Thank you for the invitation. Here we are. We've got lots to do today, and you're great to join us. As Tom said, we've set aside the 12th of December every year for the last 30 years as Cybersecurity Day. As you know, we've been doing a good deal of work on cyber with the help of many of you. So we're going to get moving right away and tell you how important this is. And also, how great it is to have as our special guest honoree the former president of Estonia, who has done remarkable work in this field. As you know, has helped us, this little country of Estonia, really shine as a star in this area. And we're not only going to recognize him, but he's going to speak to us in the second half of our morning session. And has lots to talk about, so it's great to be here. Now, I think before we start, I'd like to just kind of go around and ask each of you to tell us who you are. You're an impressive group, but I'm not sure you all know each other, so let's kind of be here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Stuart Russell. I'm a Cybersecurity Fellow at the Belfast Centre at Harvard.
I'm John Savage, I'm on the computer science faculty at Brown University.
I'm Alan Citron, I'm a principal with Risk Masters. We advise businesses on business continuity and operational risk.
Andre Zaborski, formerly chairman and CEO of the technology company out of Hong Kong, currently focused on cybersecurity and cyber specifically as a core area to cybersecurity.
Derek Reveron, professor at the Naval War College.
Mike Gillen, U.S. Department of Defense Cybersecurity, here at Harvard as a research fellow.
I'm Jennifer Murley, also from Brown University.
Bruce Schneier, I teach cybersecurity at the Kennedy School, among lots of other things.
I'm Nagi Shukri from the faculty in the Department of Political Science and IT.
Dick Pirazzolo Company, Public Relations, and also I work with Boston Global Forum on media relations and other matters.
Tom Patterson, I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Barry Noller, former communications director for the Joint Economic. And I also at Harvard Kennedy.
I'm David Burbach, I'm the faculty at the Naval War College.
I'm Ron Sandler, I work at the Ethics Institute at Northeastern University.
Alex Jones, I'm a student at Northeastern University.
Brentany Lograj, I'm
A little louder.
I'm a resident psychiatrist at Brigham Women's Hospital.
Actually, resident psychiatrist at Brigham Women's Hospital as well.
David Tapp, I'm a college senior here at Harvard.
Dave Silverswag, chairman of psychiatry at Brigham Women's Hospital, academic dean at Harvard Medical School.
I'm a Anderson, I'm an undergrad student here at Harvard. I'm Summer Marion, I'm a doctoral student at Northeastern University, and previously worked at Harvard.
I'm Bethesda from
We come from the Ministry of Public Security of Vietnam.
I'm Chi from Ministry of Public Security.
Jean-Marc Monroe, CEO of Clean Membrane, Loeb Startup.
Saranya Dikmar, I'm an undergraduate studying computer science.
Eric Zuberg from Brown University, professor of engineering.
Ines Suberg from the Latvian Heritage Foundation in Boston chair.
Thank you very much for joining us. So we're still on. Tom is right. The guy behind all this is Twan. And he's very persuasive. We happen to be on the same nonprofit board, that's where we met. And I think I was on 6 nonprofit boards at the time. And somehow we convinced me to get involved with this. But he does all the work, and we just kind of show up and do the best we can. That's not exactly true, but this has been a very interesting experience, I think, for both of us. And has had a benefit from a personal standpoint for me of getting me into foreign policy, which I've always been very interested in, although most of my political career was involved at the state level level. And it's really been a fascinating ride, but very important that all of you understand the moving force behind this, as Tom said, is Swan. We're very grateful for him and to the folks that work with him to put this together. And this, as I said, is the 3rd year in a row where in December we have global cybersecurity day. We've got some interesting things planned for you, including the opportunity to meet and listen to former President Estonia, who himself has an interesting background, spent his boyhood in young years here in New Jersey, went to Columbia Graduate School at Penn, and then went on to do lots of other things, including becoming President Estonia 2 times. Has been a real tower of strength in this field, and it's one of the reasons why little Estonia today has advanced in this field as it is. So what we're going to do this morning is start with some brief remarks from 3 folks. Joe Nye has been a wonderful friend and colleague in this place. And Nancy Chukri, who herself has spent a lot of time with us. And then Eric Reverend. Then we're going to listen to the former president of the speak to us for the right now. And then have a good, I hope, lively discussion around his remarks. do a few other things, rather than doing it. So that makes sense to all. Anyway, Joe, let me begin with Joe now.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Twan, for your leadership on the Boston Global Forum. There are a variety of ways of approaching the topic this morning. I'm going to talk about the question of whether we can develop norms internationally to govern conflict in cyberspace. And basically, I'm going to this morning repeat in, I think Juan said 20 minutes or less, the things that I said last week to the Chinese conference on the internet, Wujiang. I just got back from Beijing at 2 a.m. yesterday. So if I fall asleep in the middle of my talk, please forgive me. I'm permitted to, you're not. So what I talk about is normative restraints on cyber conflict. And I ask, where does the world stand in the development of norms to restrain conflict in cyberspace? I don't know if any of you have seen the new site that the Council on Foreign Relations now, Siegel, has put up, trying to catalog the number of interstate attacks. And it's quite fascinating to look at the shape of the curve since about 2004. It just has a steep upward slope if you go consult that. The question I think of whether we can develop international agreements or norms to restrain cyber attacks by states. Remember, cyber attacks, attack is a very vague word for a wide range of things, but I'm talking about the use of cyber for malicious purpose by state actors. And I've tried to argue elsewhere in this article in the Strategic Studies Quarterly that states take a while to learn how to manage and do disruptive technology. And while nuclear technology is totally different from cyber technology, if somebody put it, nuclear technology can end the world, while cyber technology can disrupt the world. There is some difference there. But that's not the point I want to make. What I want to make is a larger historical point, which is how do states learn when you have a very disruptive technology to essentially encompass it in a set of rules of the road or norms. And while the two technologies are vastly different, I think we can learn something about the process of how states learn to cope with highly disruptive technologies. And it's interesting if you look at how long it took states to learn to develop some norms to restrict nuclear technology. It was about 2 decades after Hiroshima before you saw any progress. And depending on how you count, we're somewhere at about the 2-decade mark in terms of cyber. Now you would say to me, whoa, that's terribly off because the origins of the internet go all the way back to late 60s and early 70s. But if you think about cyber as a security problem, it really becomes a major security problem at the end of the 1990s, when it becomes a basic substratum for economics and political relations. And you've all seen that famous hockey stick graph where, you know, cyber uptake goes very slowly until you get the web, and after you get the web and browsers, it really takes off around 96, 97. and this is the famous hockey stick that we see. Now, with that enormous interdependence that comes with that interconnectedness, you find that interdependence produces huge benefits, but also huge vulnerabilities. And with vulnerabilities comes insecurity. So essentially, cyber, I would argue, is at about the same 2-decade mark in terms of being a major security problem. Now, if you look at the nuclear example, you will find that the first efforts to control this new nuclear technology were centered around major United Nations treaties. And incidentally, that's what the Russians and Chinese want today, a big UN treaty. Our lead in the 1940s meant that we proposed the treaty, and we proposed the group plan, where the UN would own and control nuclear technology, just as the Chinese and Russians want the International Telecommunications Union to have that kind of role. Of course, the Russians turned that down. They weren't going to give up the technology they were stealing from us. Spies, they want their own nuclear weapon. And so these efforts in the first decade, the UN-centered efforts were fed. It really wasn't until after the fight that we induced in each other in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that you got the beginnings of real efforts to set norms to surround this new disruptive technology. And the first was the limited test ban treaty, which you might note was a very limited thing, which was essentially an environmental treaty. It was a game against nature to prevent strontium-90 poisoning us all. And that was followed in 1968 with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which again was a game in which the U.S. and Soviet Union cooperated against third parties, other countries developing weapons, rather than dealing directly with each other. So it really wasn't until the 70s, which is 30 years after Hiroshima, before you got the strategic arms limitation talks, which is direct U.S.-Soviet negotiations, which produced something which began to set constraints on this new threatening technology. Now, what's interesting is that the parallel process is that China and other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Group have followed what Russia proposed in 1999, which is a full-fledged United Nations treaty, in their words, to ban electronic information weapons. Electronic information weapons. Notice how broad that is. That would also include propaganda. It would include banning what the Russians just did, like such a treaty existed. The trouble with such a treaty, as the Americans pointed out, and have pointed out consistently since 1999, is it's totally unverifiable. It's a set of words that makes us feel good, but essentially which has almost no effect on view of behavior. Instead, what the U.S. and other countries proposed that was agreed upon was that the UN Secretary General should set up a group of governmental experts, the UNGG. They first met in 2004. Initially, it had very meager results. It didn't accomplish very much. But the interesting thing is that by July of 2015, it was able to issue a report in which the 15 members, by then expanded to 20, were able to set an agreement or have a consensus on a set of processes and procedures which would set some limits on cyber attacks by states, particularly against critical infrastructure. What's interesting is that the report, the 2015 report of the UNGG, was taken to the group of 20 most powerful economies in the world and was endorsed by the group of 20. Now, if you know anything about the way the UN works, the basement is full of rooms, groups of experts on this, that, and the other thing. And rarely does their product rise above the basement level. So it's quite remarkable that the UNGG produced a report which was endorsed by the 20 most powerful economies in the world. But before you say, that was good news, they met again, and in 2017, this past summer, they failed to reach consensus. They expanded the group as more states demanded to be parts of it. With the expansion, it was more difficult to have consensus. In addition to that, there were deep problems in the political relationship between the United States and Russia in the aftermath of the Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And China began to backtrack because China has the feeling that the internet should be subject to sovereign controls. And so China worried a little bit that in signing on to the 2015 report, it was weakening this new strengthened position that takes China's traditional position and sort of doubles it or squares it, if you want, which is the Xi Jinping regime is trying to have tighter and tighter party control of everything in China, including the internet. So 2017, the UNGG fails to continue the progress that it had initially shown in its report of 2015. Now, to understand the GGE, it helps to put it in the broader context of normative constraints on states. We often think about international law, and the Talon Manual is an effort by a group of international lawyers to write down what's agreed to be international law and how it applies to the internet. There's still a disagreement among both lawyers about some of the clauses and things in the Talon Manual. But it would be a pity if we restrained our imagination to efforts to have interstate control or setting up rules of the road for the internet, if we just restricted ourselves to binding international law. As Martha Finnemore and Duncan Hollis have argued in a recent paper called Constructing Norms for Global Cybersecurity, a norm is a collective expectation of proper behavior of actors with a given identity. And norms apply to multiple actors, and they're not legally binding. In that sense, they're different from international law. So if you think about the different types of normative constraints on states, you can imagine formal interstate agreements, international law, which takes the form of either treaties or have evolved over time to be what's called customary. But there's also practice, common practices, which become norms in the sense of expected collective behavior. And then there are also sort of codes and rules of the road for conduct. So there are different degrees of formalism in the normative constraints we mentioned. So if you think of formal agreements, you think of a treaty. If you think of common practices that make the internet work, it might be routing practices, exchanging with the gateway protocols and so forth. You look at the naming system. These are practices which make things work. And then you have sort of efforts to develop codes, sort of rules of the road. And that's where the GGE came in, which was to try to create a code or norm which says that you will not attack critical infrastructure and you will not interfere with each other's certs as they try to understand attacks and problems. Notice what I've restricted myself to so far is different degrees of formalism in the normal constraints, but they're all at the global level. What I'm arguing is that in the aftermath of the failure of the GGE this past summer, we ought to think about different levels of agreement in terms of their scope. So think of a matrix, additional formalism, which I described. You can also think of different degrees of inclusiveness. And you can have global, which I've described so far. You can also have plurilateral and regional. Those are not all states, but some states. And you can also have below that pure bilateral agreements. If you put those together, formal agreements, common practices, norms, and codes, degrees of formalism with global, plurilateral, and bilateral as different degrees of inclusiveness, you obviously get a simple 9-cell matrix. And only one cell of that matrix is the UN GGP acting at the global level. And we should not let the failure of the GGP deter us from wanting to compare 8 other venues where in this matrix where we could be trying to develop rules of the road or normative restraints on state conduct. To give certain examples, plurilateral and regional kinds of disputes, you have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is not universal, but it starts in Europe, but it has now adherence to other Latin states criminal aspects. Along with that, in practice, you have the cooperation that's developing in Europol and Interpol on crime. On common practices, you might see something like the codes of conduct among like-minded states. So if you ask, could we get a declaration of internet freedom, which is universal, you know, that there is a right to communicate universally, but you can call it universal right within the context of the UN Convention on human rights. Chances of China or Russia signing on to something like that are, if not zero, asymptotic zero. This is not going to happen. But could you imagine Brazil and India and Australia and Japan joining Europe with us to say that we should make sure that the internet stays open to the extent that we're able to? Yes, and then you would face people say, but that's fragmentation of the internet. Well, I hate to tell you, but the internet is already fragmented. Anybody who thinks there's a global universal internet hasn't been to China lately. I just came back from there. And the internet is not universally open. But you could imagine a set of very significant states representing a large portion of the world economy taking a position of self-restraint on rules of the road to keep it real open. And when you come to norms and codes at the plurilateral regional level, you can imagine organizations like ASEAN and other regional organizations trying to do something similar. And finally, at the bottom of my 3 levels of inclusiveness are bilateral agreements. And you can say, well, what's the value of bilateral agreements? You know, just 2 states. How does that affect international norms and constraints? Well, let's think about the case of the U.S. and China for a minute. Remember I said that the US and China had very different differences, very important differences on rules for the internet. I just cited one about freedom of speech or content. But let me give you another example, which is for years the United States complained bitterly to the Chinese that their use of cyber espionage to steal intellectual property from American companies and deliver it to Chinese companies was outrageous. And the Chinese reply was, look, you're spying on us all the time by cyber means. So what if we do something? First we deny we do that. And then the standard procedure here is, having denied we did it, we said you do it too. So, and that Xi Jinping and Obama met at Sunnylands in California in 2013, and that issue was top of priority for the United States at the meeting. And then the Snowden affair occurred. The Snowden affair let China off the hook. All the Chinese wanted to talk about was the evils of the United States as revealed by Snowden. So they totally dropped this. Then the United States basically said, we're serious. We had the indictment of 5 PLA officers. We had an executive order in the spring of 2015 saying that we were going to impose sanctions against companies that stole or took possession of stolen intellectual property. And the first reaction of the Chinese to this was to break the arrangements that have been made to have a relatively low-level cyber consultative group. Chris Cater chaired on our side from the State Department, and the Chinese said, "We pull out of that. You know, you invite our officers, even though they're never going to go to jail. It's an affront to us, and we're breaking our cooperative relations in cyber." And then the United States said, you know, there's a summit in September 2015. And if you want this summit to succeed, we're going back to 2013, what we put on the table. We are sick and tired of using cyber espionage to steal intellectual property to transfer your companies. It's corrupting the level playing field or the degree of fairness that we expect in the international trading system. You know, it's one thing to have espionage. We all do it all the time, all states. But the idea that you corrupt the trade system by this type of theft is unfair. And it's different than the traditional form of stealing commercial proprietary secrets, because it's quick, it's cheap, and it's more plausibly deniable. So you say, what's new? What's new is you send an electron across the border. You don't have to train the electron. You don't have to worry about your spy being caught with a briefcase full of documents and so forth. So the American position was, if you want a successful summit, you have to agree to stop this. And lo and behold, when Xi Jinping and Obama met in September 2015, the Chinese reversed their declaratory policy 180 degrees. And they agreed that they would indeed not use cyber espionage for theft of intellectual property. And as far as I'm able to discern from talking to both government officials and officials of companies like FireEye and so forth, it's been largely observed by the Chinese. There's some cases at the margins where people say, oh, this is outside of bounds and so forth. But there has been a discernible change in Chinese behavior. Now, just to conclude this, what's interesting is that this bilateral agreement didn't stay in this little box of a 9-fold matrix called bilateral. It was essentially taken by China and the US to the group of 20 and there it was endorsed by a much broader set of states. So it became the core, the kernel of a broader framework of agreement about norms and constraints on one dimension of cyber conflict, which is using cyber risk to monitor that property. Now, that doesn't mean that that problem is solved with the cyber conflict itself, but it does illustrate that when we look at the failure of GGE last summer, which is in this cell matrix, which is broad global agreements, that you can accomplish things in other areas, whether it be multilaterally or plurilaterally among like-minded states, or whether it be among states with very, very different views of the event, such as the U.S. and China, at the bilateral level. But having reached a common interest, they can then begin to generalize it to broader states. I suspect that's the way progress is going to be made. It's not going to be made by some large UN agreement. It's not going to be made by reconvening the UNGGE at let's say 40 states or 70 states, as some people talk about. I think that would be a recipe for basically burying the efforts developing cyber norms. But finding ways in which states can negotiate their concrete interests and then broaden that from a bilateral or small group to something which other states can sign on to, strikes me as a much more plausible approach that we should be following as we look toward creating normal constraints on states in the future. Now, to conclude, there's an interesting question, which is, could you imagine doing this with Russia on the issue of interference in each other's election campaigns? After the Russian events of Russian interference in 2016, and I should point out that information warfare interfering in elections is not new. Americans have done it in the Cold War, other Russians have done it in other countries. What's new, again, is how quick and easy and reliable it is. So it's really like the point of intellectual property theft by cyber means. It's not that it's totally new, it's that of course the technology has made something which just grows exponentially in terms of probable relations. So could you imagine an analogy to what I said about how you work step by step, first environmental treaty with nuclear test ban, adversary test ban, to a non-proliferation treaty which was aimed at third parties, states, to direct bilateral restraints among countries which were bitter antagonists of the United States and the Soviet Union, but we were able to get assaulted. And the question is, in the cyber area, is it possible to imagine doing with the Russians on interference with each other's elections something similar to what we did with the Chinese on theft of intellectual property? And before we conclude, yes, I should point out to you, it's going to be much harder. The relationship between the United States and Russia is much more fraught than it is with China. Well, there is a massive economic interdependence with China. And the other problem, of course, is that how would you verify this? The United States had a list of 16 critical infrastructures. So the GGE rules were supposed to prevent interference with critical infrastructures. The United States, after the 2016 election, added 17 critical infrastructure, which was the Texas. Is it plausible that we and the Russians can sit down and get some sort of negotiation back? I think the odds are low, but I think it's still worth trying. So that's my effort to try to portray for you what I said in China last week, which is that despite the failure of UNGP this summer, efforts to create global restraints on cyber conflict among states is not dead. And there are many other avenues where we should try to proceed besides the UNGP. Thank you.
Joe, thanks so much for getting us started and giving us some reason. And it's hard to develop to do all of it. It's great to begin with you. But now I'm going to turn to Nazim Shukri, who's at MIT, is a valued member of this organization, this forum for some time. And he's going to talk to us about strategy.
There's been a minor change in the focus of what I was assigned, and given the 20 minutes, and we just started a minor change, short, and then what I was assigned, short. So, the thing to do is, to prohibit the question, the deviation has to do with the fact that, even though the United States gets here, I thought it might be useful to share with some of our efforts to understand the architecture of the Italian manual. The one on this one.
Lovely. Lovely. You send me only back. You send me only.
I think it was 6 morning. Let me verb what I would have shown you, and that is you have 600 pages give or take, and 154 rules. Very, very, very dense. And I'm sure you have hits. So what I want you to do is share with you a couple of network views of the Italian manual. Imagine that you've read it and you know what the subject is about, but you really want to know how they connect to each other, why, and does it make any difference. And there may be other things that you really want to know. So I've taken the liberty of reminding you of what our visitor said, and that is that law provides a roadmap, and you might as well follow it. You know that the manual is in 4 segments, and each segment, this is the network view of the entire system. So one thing, and I'd like to simply highlight. I didn't want that. That's not part of
You like music?
This is a product of transforming the text into the decision structure matrix, just for looking at the rules. The focus of this is the rules, the distinguish the chapters, whatever it is. And then the rules are made by how important they are, calculating the eigenvalues. And the only thing I want to draw your attention to is the bigger rules, the bigger ones. It's no surprise that number 4 right there has something to do with sovereignty. And as you go down further, you will see that the sovereign element goes through and the connections to the others follow suit. Now, without knowing exactly what the rules are and having them by heart, it's difficult to make sense of what this is. But imagine that you have this and you have a list of rules next to you, and just check. The alternative, of course, is to go through the 600 pages. But the reason we're interested in this is that not all rules are created equal from the point of view, not law, but from the point of view of the way they are addressed and treated in the Italian language. And not all of them are connected to the rest of the legal system as well. And this is the specialized regimes, and the specialized regimes, air law, air, sea, and a few others. And pieces of those regimes that exist in place are taken out by the Italian manual and put in there. But still the dominance of war. And this is international peace and security. And back there, notice that it's back there, it's not integrated in the whole thing. has to do with the law of cyber armed conflict. You could say that this can possibly represent the current manual, and I will tell you that mathematically it does. It may not be the intent of the authors, but for us, it's very interesting to see the big ones are over here. There's only 92 over there that is on the armed conflict. That's it, yeah. So my suggestion is, let's look at the kind of manual. Take your time and go through the 600 pages, and then think of the visual representation with this next to you. Finito. And now I have to turn to what it was assigned to me. No. Yes. One of the notable presidential directives, notable meaning that not very much there to object to, is the one that was issued on May 19 this year, to try to, as a directive to try to improve the nation's posture on cybersecurity. And specifically focused on these are the actions that have taken context. So what we're concerned about is, all right, very nice. What is it that we think we can contribute to as an example to a research project designed specifically to contribute to the presidential executive order? And it occurred to us that there are some gaps in how we think about cybersecurity and what we think we ought to be doing. So what we decided to do is to do a test, a pre-test, a proof of concept around the notion that, around the hypothesis that there's lots of data around, that lots and lots of tools to work with. The problem is that the data are all over the place and they're disconnected, and it takes an awful lot of time and effort to sort of together data on the cyber threats, etc., for the infrastructure. Then there's lots and lots and lots of data in highlighting what you should and should not do. Again, disconnected, etc. And one agency that puts it all together in some way, in this one place, doesn't connect them, but puts them all together, at least you know where to go, is NIST, as an example. So we focus on since we can develop a one-stop full package set of tools to help industries or agencies or entities to steer through, figure out what data they need, decide their cybersecurity problem, because this provides you perfect problems. If you're this is the right model. If your board is this will be helpful to you. Here in the paragraph, another pile of data that says that, well, if you have this problem, we have guidelines for you, put it over there. So the simple technical problem of seamlessness might help an analyst to pull together what is relevant to them. Interesting thing about that is that what we're emphasizing here is there's a number two is not really stated right. It's not creating large data sets with guidelines. It is creating the tools for selecting and linking what you need. And I'm not arguing for big data. See, whatever we have here is plenty to start with. And once you put together the database, then we really want to set analytics to understand what's the problem, what's the issue down on the floor, because the problem proves of my enterprise, your enterprise. All of these things we assume we do, but actually we do it descriptively, we don't do it systematically. Having gone through the proof of concept, I know for a fact that we don't have a full end-to-end history. The next bit of this is, after we establish one group of the system, is, all right, enterprise responses. If this is our problem, this is our dilemma, whether we go back again to this set of data, on guidelines, directives, etc., as a starting point to see whether there's any kind of match there. Any undergraduate can do this quite easily. But the dilemma is that even if the undergraduate puts it together, which is matching guidelines that meet the problem that you have in your enterprise, there's still the minor matter of the CEO up there, plus that top layer, who really isn't quite understanding what's going on, nor would believe what an undergraduate says, or would what's on his boss, and the gap between what is relevant to here and what is relevant to the as-is system and the ground truth is rather big. So part of the dilemma in the general area of national response to cybersecurity threats is organizational, as you know, and institutional, as you know, and ways of reducing the gap between them that direct and them that operate. So the end point is we would recognize that we got somewhere if these and these are consolidating, understand, and agree in principle as to what might be common response to a set of problems that they all know that they have, and has been validated by the fact that NIST has characterized the reference model and provides a set of tools to deal with it. Now, you will probably wonder what possible contribution could one little project related to improving our approach to the analysis of infrastructure threats and responses to make the scheme of things. My answer would be that we've always argued more data, more data, more data, more data. And the fact of the matter is we don't know how to use the data that we have well. And we're certainly not connecting the response side of the guidelines, directives, thou shalt not do this, whatever it is, with what the nature of the diagnosis, the diagnostics has been. So we know that if we're able to provide a supply chain of response patterns and underlies are summarized, then the next step would be to see that it's scalable. And if it's scalable, then we're moving in the right direction. If it's not scalable, too bad. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nat. Our third presenter this morning is who was with the one college, part of the form of graduate students.
Well, good morning, and probably goes without saying, I speak for myself, not to be confused with any official statement. And what Tuan had asked me to do is organize a group of us, and so there are 6 of us involved in developing a paper, which you should have received via email. If not, it will be posted on the BGF website. So what animated us was really sort of the theme I think we'll get to soon, is looking really at cyber defense strategy for a nation. And I think the 6 of us use sort of the attack against the Ukrainian power plant as sort of our animating idea, and we looked at other attacks on critical infrastructure. And so at least I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors. So Jackie Schneider, my colleague from the Navy War College, Mike Miner, who is sick at home watching us live via the stream. Hi, Mike. John Savage, who's a computer science professor at Brown University. Alan Citron, who works in the cybersecurity field professionally, and then Tuan. And so when you start to ask the question, what happens when you get computer scientists, political scientists, and people working in the cybersecurity field to write a paper, this is what we have. But I would like to start really a quote that I often like to start talks with, And so some of my students are here, so I'm glad that you came, so you've seen this before. But it came from the former NSA director, Mike Hayden. And so he described, quote, "Rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less clarity and less apparent understanding than cybersecurity. I have sat in very small group meetings in Washington, unable, along with my colleagues, to decide on a course of action because we lacked a clear picture of the long-term legal and policy implications of any decision we might make." So I applaud Governor Dukakis and Tuan for convening us regularly for the last several years to think about these issues, because I think days like this help us try to think more coherently about these problems. Before I get into sort of the principles that we developed to look at the nation state level, I thought first I would highlight some structural challenges, and very much informed by, I work on US national security issues, so this is probably more endemic to US, but the more I engage internationally on these topics, there's some similarities. But some structural challenges in terms of thinking about why understanding cybersecurity is so difficult. First, I would say, related to what Joe and I raised earlier, is cybersecurity really challenges how we think about domestic and foreign boundaries. And in national security, what's domestic and what's foreign is one of the really critical questions that we often deal with. Because militaries, intelligence services are often focused externally, prevent invasion, meet challenges far from your shores. But when it comes to cyber threats, as we all know, boundaries have less meaning. And it becomes much more difficult to sort of think about national security and cybersecurity because of the boundaries start to lose meaning. The second idea, I think, really, more particular to the US, is it starts challenging distinction among the different federal entities that are engaged in national security. So, for example, in the US, we like to clarify roles and missions, and what Nosley presented in terms of that executive order, really trying to help us think systematically about who in the federal government is responsible for cybersecurity, and there's ongoing efforts to do that. But we seldom think about the impact of organizational interests and the impact of different statutory authorities where law guides these entities. So that the easy examples I would highlight is the tension between, say, intelligence agencies and cyber commands. Former Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter, who's now the co-chair of the Belfer Center, has a wonderful piece up on the Belfer website from October, really talking about the fight against ISIS. And there's a few paragraphs on the cyber dimension that he highlights in terms of he thought as Secretary of Defense giving a simple order, go attack ISIS in cyberspace would result in some success. But he very much highlighted that the different organizational missions conflicted. So, for example, Cybercom might be able to go attack networks, but then the intelligence communities would regret the loss of the collection. And so you have an internal tension between the intelligence agencies and Cyber Command. Likewise, the Department of State was concerned if you start conducting attack has specific meaning in international law, and that would require notifications to our Congress first. And secondly, if your attack is traveling across networks through other countries, clearance should be requested. And so I urge you to look at Ash Carter's piece from early October on ISIS to sort of describe a little bit more of these things. And then you can also look at, again, tension between the private sector wants to give us higher levels of encryption, so we're all safer. But yet intelligence agencies really, I think I'll go back to the early 90s when we first started this discussion on encryption, want to hold back higher levels of encryption because they need that to improve collection, improve transparency. Another challenge I would highlight that I don't think has been talked about too deeply, which I think is essential, so glad to see a number of people from the private sector here, is cybersecurity really challenges our understanding about what's public and what's private for defense. So sovereignty, as we all know, belongs to governments, but cyberspace is created, owned, and monitored primarily by private companies, publicly traded companies. The operating systems, hardware, telecom lines, they're corporate, not government. And often these companies are global, not national. And so what we're starting to see in this space when it comes to norm development, it's not only governments and UN bodies, but we see Microsoft, for example, promoting international norms. We see Facebook attempting to counter misinformation. We see Twitter attempting to conduct sort of counterterrorism on its feeds. That governments and international institutions are not the only ones in this space, and I would sort of argue that companies are probably more important in my personal view than governments in this space. Another challenge really relates to some comments that Joe and I had raised is it's hard to start isolating sort of malicious cyber attack, and we gave us sort of the positive on the US-China one, from broader bilateral issues. And so if we sort of, how we were able to get to that 2015 agreement, it was complicated by things that came before, issues such as trade, foreign direct investment, debt, North Korea. At the time, it was climate change was important, as well as disputes in the South China Sea, East China Sea. Cyber was maybe one thing on the list of 10 that the two countries had to wrestle with. And so as we get inspired to think about how might the US and Russia, for example, come to some agreement, we have to look about in the broader agenda that exists between the two countries, not just the cyber agenda. And then finally, I would say challenges, as we think about the international system. Again, Joe and I was thinking as you were talking, as often was said about Plato and philosophy, all of philosophy since Plato is but a footnote to Plato. I'm starting to think almost everything that we've been talking about international affairs and cybersecurity is but a footnote to you. So thank you for being a thought leader in this space. But as we start thinking about privacy and access in the US, we think privacy is extremely important. Internet access is extremely important. I know my kids think access is a basic human right. Europe, I think they take it even further to the extreme. The right to be forgotten and privacy laws are much more, valued than, say, in the United States. And then we contrast that, where Russia and China, internet freedom is considered a threat to authoritarianism. So this complicates sort of the efforts, that Joe was highlighting in terms of trying to get to some cyber norms and cyber agreements. Countries simply have different approaches. And then you see global companies sort of caught in between the two spaces that, for Google to operate in China, for example, they have to give up some of the values that they hold dearly when they operate in the United States. So with this broad context in mind, we're proposing some principles that would guide, and the paper really fleshes it out, so I won't dwell too deeply here. And then when we get to the Q&A, I'm going to, I'll direct all of our questions to Jackie and John, because they were, I think, principally driving some of these important ideas. So the first principle I would say is characterize the threshold for action. If states understand when actors view cyber attacks as national security incidents, then they can create more tailored deterrent strategies. At the same time, understanding adversaries' threshold for actions allows states to combat threats with counter cyber operations that avoid escalation. The second principle, which was more contentions with us, so I hope we talk about this one. So it's hard to get 6 people to agree. I think we found language we all agreed to. But this next one was a harder one, and I think countries are wrestling with this, is resolve hackback authority. Our compromise language was governments attempt to control subversive cyber behavior within their borders with prohibitions against hacking. But there's strong incentives, both technical and economic, for companies to pursue some level of hackback against cyber attacks. But to avoid escalation and misinterpretation, we think governments should retain the monopoly on legitimate use of force, and both kinetic and cyber, and prevent companies from conducting unilateral actions. But that's something I think we can talk more about. The next bit, because we're primarily interested in critical infrastructure attack, and so this is where I'm grateful, really go to Tuan's ideas and the governor's and Jackie's in terms of critical infrastructure attacks are going to have a local impact. But often as we think about cybersecurity, we're up at the national and international level. But if the power here goes down in Cambridge, or the T is not working from a cyber reason, not for other reasons, it's really, we need to make sure that connection exists between national and local governments, and making sure local responders really know what challenge they're really facing when they show up to fix things. Next is really, collaborate across borders, and I worked well there because Trevor really highlighted that. Within a country, facilitate cooperation across critical sectors. I think we can look at certain sectors around the world. Some are better than others. Financial services have a very strong ability to share and work with each other. Telecoms could do as well. Retailers less so. And so one of the things that we can think about is how you can facilitate coordination across different sectors. Next is engage the civilian information technology sector and to see how they're wrestling with this space, recognizing cyber is a civilian space, and so vendors have to be deeply involved in these discussions. Next, at the citizen level, empower digital literacy in education. And then next, really my colleague Chris Demchak from the Naval War College has done a lot of great work on resilience, for example. And so how do we practice comprehensive resilience? When those attacks do occur, things do shut down, how are companies, how are municipalities, state governments prepared for that? And then finally, build partnerships among developed and developing countries. One of the things I'm grateful for the discussions I had with Twan is, we're having very deeply informed discussions here, and they are around the world, but what about countries that are really in that developing stages? How do we connect with them? How do we share lessons? How do we build those relationships? How do we make their systems more resilient, their citizens more digitally literate? So with that, I would just like to say, the principles are more fully fleshed out on the paper that you received and up on the VGF website. And we hope these will guide cyber defense strategy development at the nation state level. And we look forward to your comments after that. Thanks.
Sure, thanks very much. You tried to honor a special person in cybersecurity organization, and we're very, very fortunate to be able to honor somebody who's had a long and very interesting career recently. This general area, both in terms of Estonia's remarkable development and now international dimension. I won't go into great detail about his career, except to say that it's an interesting one, which is in Europe. Brought in New Jersey at around his early age, and he grew up in Columbia, graduate study at the University of Pennsylvania, went back to Europe, where he was division chief created for Europe, with special responsibilities for Eastern Europe. Managed to get into Estonia after some effort before the Great of the Soviet Union. Then began working very closely with the Estonian government. At a particular moment in time, he was asked to become a candidate for the presidency. He did better than I did. He got elected. He served for 2 full terms as the president of Estonia. And has had a great deal to do not only with the remarkable development of this tiny country in this field, but now increasingly as a leader internationally with this thing we're working on. And so it's just a great honor for us to recognize him this year as a world leader in cybersecurity, and ask him to speak to us, and then we're going to have a good roundtable discussion, I hope, with him before we wrap up this morning. President. We have a plaque for him. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of you for your work.
Well, thank you.
You can sit here and stand here and you take a picture.
Okay. Where are the cameras?
Yes.
Very nice.
Well, thank you very much. Before I start off, actually, I start off with a two-finger comment on Joe Nye, which is just that the Russian article in Politico last week about the Russian taking offer of the U.S. on a bilateral treaty which the U.S. rejected. Of course, I mean, as a European, I would say, yeah, of course, the Russians who have clearly meddled in Germany, UK, Spain, Italy, World Agency, World Anti-Doping Agency, that it doesn't really encourage us if there's a bilateral treaty and where that to continue relations. But basically, the U.S. rejected it because it's kind of asymmetric, because it's you already know election. So, I mean, what's the American going to do? Anyway, to get to my talk. I'm going to start talking about security sort of from a ground up level, because I actually think that spend on that security has, at least in all post-Enlightenment democracies, based its approach on the Locke's model that the individual gives up his right, the Hobbesian right to kill someone else to the state in return for security, be it your local police, your national security agencies, or internationally in the Army. And that what we have done in Estonia is actually put the state at the center of the security. At the same time, lest you think we're kind of dirigist European government, we're probably far less intrusive in people's lives than the United States. But more broadly, I think we have to rethink most aspects of our lives in looking at living in digital age. Basically, ever since William Gibson, in his dystopian novel Necromancer, took Norbert Wiener's term cybernetic and popularized the prefix cyber. This prefix has proliferated to almost all spheres of human activity, which I think is an indication of how much the digital world has permeated our lives. So you have cyberpunk, cybercrime, cyber hygiene, cyberspace, cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber war, cybersecurity, and of course, inevitably cyber sex. Rather than bemoan, I somehow the ubiquitous use of the prefix, saying it's meaningless, I actually welcome the ubiquity to emphasize how profoundly our lives and our societies, our nations, indeed almost all human endeavor has come to be dependent upon digital communication. So basically, the privacy of emails or our electoral democracy to our infrastructure, ride and apartment sharing, the integrity of our financial system, banking, the ads that we see on social media during electoral campaigns. All of these are subject to manipulation and attack. All of these, with the exception of social media and the sharing economy, also existed before the digital era. But they now have all been altered by the free movement of electrons and are in a completely different form, which requires us to rethink much of how we do things in all other aspects and realms of human activity. And this is, of course, all due to the increasing power of the silicon chip, or something known as Moore's Law, which doubles every year in half, even if it's slowing down a bit. Because we are pushing the limits of physics. But basically, the world is nonetheless completely different from the way it was 25 years ago. And while all things digital have changed beyond belief, governments, policies, laws, regulations actually have failed to keep up with this. And of course, when we talk about what can the government do on cybersecurity, whatever government is, that's very good. But on the other hand, we actually have not looked at all the rest of life. When we have events such as the 145 million adults in the United States had all of their financial records stolen. I mean, that's probably 80% of the adult population. It is completely untouched by government regulation, except for the fact probably from sort of old style rules that the management sold their stocks before informing the population that their data had been stolen. But we have to come to terms with this as a much broader issue. And I guess most importantly, if we look at it, is that at the core of our digital security, and I'm not talking about the government and the NSA and our electrical infrastructure, but basically what we do online, all of us, started out 35 years ago with a system that worked fine then, when there were about 3,500 academics using a network called BitNet, where security relied on an email address, almost always ending in the top level domain of .edu, and these people generally did not pose a security or criminal threat. Yet today there are 4.2 billion people online. We fear all these things: cyber wars, crime, doxed emails. But basically what we're dealing with is that since we use BitNet, we've had 22 or 23 iterations of Moore's Law, which means that today computers are 8.4 million times more powerful than they were when we started using this system among 3,500 academics. And we also, so we have an increase of roughly the same order of magnitude from 3.5 thousand people using BitNet to 3.5 to 4.2, depending on the vast billion people online. We've been very slow to realize this, as Joe and I pointed out in an article 6 years ago, immediately after the Munich Security Conference. Without naming me, he quoted me. I said, "This is the first time the Munich Security Conference has ever dealt with the issue of cybersecurity." That was 2011. Up to 2011, the Munich Security Conference, the premier conference on security of the world, did not have a single panel on the issue of cybersecurity. Now, of course, the Munich Security Conference has an entire separate conference on cybersecurity. But that just shows how recently this was not considered an issue. Now, what I'll try to do today is try to look at cybersecurity kind of at three levels, beginning with the individual, and then moving on to the state, and then finally getting to the international level. And again, to reiterate, my point of view is that security has been the responsibility of the state pre-digital, and it remains so today, but the state has failed to keep up in general in most places, and that this does remain a key aspect of the Lockean social contract, where we do give up certain rights in exchange for protection against sort of Hobbesian war, all against all war. But this also sort of gotten there in the analog or physical world. We are very slow to get there in the digital world. And ultimately, I would argue that security is a political choice based on policies, laws, and deriving from those laws, regulations. And just as we have in the physical analog world, civilian control of the military as a core concept in democracy, hobbyist workers, laws regulating use of guns. Again, when we get to digital, we're fairly poor in this respect. So, when we come to the cyber world, I argue are too focused on the technology rather than the policies, laws, and regulations. I say this especially now knowing the system that we have created in Estonia, that actually the technology is not that advanced. But we are way ahead of everyone else when it comes to use of digital technology. And this is a function of the laws. I should mention here that just this week, in the New Yorker, you will be able to read probably the best article I have ever written. I think I've read every single English language article that has ever come out on my country in digitization, but the best article that has appeared just came out yesterday. It's in this week's New Yorker, it's written by a guy named Nathan Heller. That sort of describes the way everything works in a very nice way, so I don't even get into that. So basically, and one thing I should add before I talk about it, there is a huge difference in this regard between what we do and I'd say most countries, because our focus has been always on the gee-whiz aspects of technology, which became clear to me when after 25 years of dealing with digitizing my country, and it was, aside from the fact I was a geek once, but which was always tough going politically, I finally sort of finished my term. My dream came true. I was invited to Stanford to the mecca of innovation in IT. And of course, that's where everything is. In a 10-mile radius of my office, I have headquarters of Apple, Google, Facebook, Tesla. I mean, you keep going on and on and on. I guess only Microsoft is really missing. And on top of that, 3 miles away from me is Sand Hill Road, which basically funds all of this enormous innovation. Yet, when I went to register my daughter to go to school, I had to bring an electricity bill to prove that I lived there. And then when after she had to take an ESL exam when she got to school in Estonia, and she placed out of taking sort of a catch-up course. And she had to give permission. I give her permission to enter a regular English class. So I had to sign 2 pieces of paper. I had to do it in one to the school, physically sign the paper. Another one 4 miles away at the municipal school district headquarters. When I got there was a line of about 20 people. And I said, well, I just have a piece of paper to drop off here. And the last person there said, we all just have a paper to drop off here, but you have to make a photocopy. And suddenly it struck me that, in fact, everything that I had been experienced in that process, except for the photocopying, was identical to the 1950s. I mean, nothing had changed, except in the 1960s, you started getting photo Xerox machines in the US school system, so you could actually make a photocopy. So again, you say that to illustrate where we are in most countries when it comes to digitization. We took a different route. I won't, by the way, mention what it's like to register a car. Usually takes 1 to 2 days, sometimes 3. Unless you buy a new car and the dealership does it for you, which I had planned to do it. But what we did in Estonia, just for background, I mean, why we did what we did was, we emerged out of the miasma of the Soviet Union in 1991. We emerged because we had been independent. In 1938, the last full year before World War II, Estonia and our linguistic cousins across the bay, the Gulf, had the same GDP per capita. When we became independent again, the difference between GDP per capita between our 2 countries was 13-fold. And we were still basically operating with no infrastructure except for military infrastructure. All roads that were built during the Soviet period were for military purposes. And so looking at this awful situation, people came up with all kinds of plans. And what I proposed, since I've been taught that a real fluke and serendipitous event, I learned a program at age 14. And I said, well, why don't we teach kids how to use computers? Which we embarked upon in 95, 96, by 97, 98. We had, all schools were online. Schools had labs, which we opened to the public after school hours, so people could learn to use computers. Keep in mind, everyone is poor, so they can't buy computers, but they do have access to them. And by this time, we sort of got into this sort of thinking that, well, maybe digitization really is the way to go for the country. But we realized somewhere around the late 90s that we could do it differently, because often we were worried even then about security and what that meant. And we do have a neighbor next to us that's very big and probably very good at causing problems in the digital realm, as the US has discovered later on. So we thought long and hard about what it is that we need to do. And one of the things we came to very quickly was the fundamental issue of cybersecurity for the population is identity. Who are you? We all know the old New Yorker cartoon on the internet, no one knows you at all. Well, it's actually the fundamental problem of cybersecurity, is that if you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know, in fact, this is where it differs from what I'll talk about later on, the kinetic world of warfare. You don't even know if it's in your own country that you are talking to, who you're talking to. And so what we realized is that we must start off with a strong digital identity, and this is one of the key axioms, I would argue, for the future of digital security. And so, of course, that sounds good theoretically. What that meant in policy terms was that in 2001, we offered everyone living in Estonia at that time, citizens, permanent residents, a unique chip-based digital identity card that was where communication was ensured with two-factor authentication with end-to-end encryption. And as I said, we did this because we realized even then that the primary model of email address plus password is not going to last for long. And in fact, today there is no password that can't be broken in the email plus password paradigm through brute force hacking. So if you don't have two-factor authentication, you might as well give up. And this already means that on most transactions that you do in life in most countries, you can't be sure of anything. We did that. In order to do this, we did this with a chip card plus code, and just for the people who are really interested in. We see in many places today two-factor authentication slowly coming in. Apple, Google, the problem with two-factor authentication the way it's done in most places. For example, at Stanford, that has become the norm because of a big hack several years ago, is that the S7 protocol, which governs the communication between mobile phone communications, has been hacked, is hackable, and in fact, the first case of a big hack was the loss of 3 million euros by a German bank this spring that did use two-factor authentication using a mobile phone second factor. So that was how we started off. We did this on a public-private sort of partnership basis. Because every interaction has to be authenticated, and the verification or certification of each transaction is done by a 50-50 public-private partnership between in a center that is half paid for by the government and half by a consortium of banks. The second step was that all this, that using a two-factor authentication with a highly encrypted public key infrastructure, meaning end-to-end encryption, meant that we could offer all people living in the country genuine security, at least, I'm sorry, I'm trying to say nothing is going to be secure, at least far more secure than the kind of security that most people enjoy in most places. We have been using, until we found out that Infineon produced a a full flawed chip. RSA 2048, we did a patch. I guess, unlike most companies and most countries, we actually said we had a problem with the chip. And now we've gone over from RSA to elliptical encryption. I should say that other countries that use the same chip, unfortunately, have not been very open about it. We were. Key is that, going back to 2001, we did one more step, which is actually the key to creating a functioning digital society, in which, again, most choices have not come to at all, which is that we gave the identity legal efficacy. That is, you can sign legal documents online with the system. That means hooking it up to a national registry. This causes howls of indignation from the Five Eyes countries, also known as the Anglosphere, UK, Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, say we will never have a digital identity, let alone any kind of legal efficacy. Which I always find kind of odd because, in fact, the United States, UK, Canada, etc., all offer passports in which the state says you are you. All we're doing is saying you are you to enable legal transactions digitally, as opposed to having it in a physical passport. The use of our system, and here we have the card, and here this is behavioral economics, is that we make it mandatory to have a card. You never have to use it, but you must have one. Why do we do that? Because uptake rates of digital identities in most countries, or today in Europe, all countries must issue or offer digital identities. The uptake rates are 15 to 25%. The early adopters are the ones who take out a card. We decided we would make it mandatory because no services will develop either in the public sector, where different ministries should be developing things, or in the private sector, which we have an interest in this, unless they know that, well, because they think that 85% of the population can't even use this service. So we have things such as digital prescription, which are used actually today by 99% of the population. You don't ever have a paper prescription. You call a doctor and you renew your prescription, or your doctor writes it in and you'll see it. Those things don't happen. No one takes the effort to develop those kinds of systems unless you have the private sector and the public sector ensure that basically everyone can use this. So this is sort of laying the groundwork for a digital society. And of course, what makes our bank transactions secure, instead of what I find here, is that you do have these old cards that are base chip based, from a phone or your card. We don't have checks in this terminal. In fact, I read recently how one system works here, that we have electronic banking. So you go online, you do something, and the bank prints a paper check and then mails it. This is not a digital society. Excuse me, how much time do I have?
Long, yes.
Okay, I mean, I can go on.
Maybe 1 hour long.
Anyway, basically, I argue that a state guaranteed ID it seems to be the main stumbling block in most countries for a secure digital society. Again, my argument is that this is simply something that in a democratic society that is responsible for the security of the citizen, it must offer this. I mean, you may not want to go the full step that we did, that you make it mandatory, but then you basically assume that digital services, at least on the part of the government, will not take off. I just read last night a perfect example of why a democratic government that wants input from its citizens needs a digital identity. in the ongoing debate on net neutrality. The FCC got over 1 million, I mean, like many federal agencies, it asked people's opinion. It got 1 million fake or bizarre, non-existent comments against net neutrality. And I don't know how many got in favor of maintaining net neutrality. But unless you can log on and be you, as a citizen of the United States, commenting on impending regulations, then what's the point of asking him? In fact, I guess 400,000 of the comments came from Russia. I mean, this is not how you run a democracy, or at least this is not how you do open government soliciting opinions from your citizens. And we have the same system in our country where, on various issues, we ask people's opinion. But you have to do it by saying who you are. If you don't say who you are, there's no point. I mean, I don't want to get into issues of anonymity and how crucial that is, or how crucial it may not be, and how it may be ultimately a victim of lack of cybersecurity in the cyber realm. But nonetheless, I would say that without a secure identity, the functioning of democracy becomes, I would maintain, stymied. Now, the second thing we did, just to talk about how we put security in the system, is designing a very different architecture from what is usually used. Most big countries or most governments have used centralized databases. The OPM had 15 million or 23 million US federal government employees, including CIA, NSA personnel, including their personal or the psychological profiles, were hacked, as you probably know, 2 years ago. Doesn't even matter who did it. The fact is that they had all of this stuff easily accessible and in clear text. It wasn't even encrypted, which I would find again kind of unnecessary. Not to mention the kind that we saw with Equifax. But what we realized quickly is that we could not have a central database for purely economic reasons. In the late 90s, everyone was going after big central servers. You know, we being sort of where we were, what we had done was that every ministry, every agency, every company had its own servers, often using different systems, and also with a great degree of independence, but at least arrogance. They were little fiefdoms. And so, in trying to figure this problem out, we had the mathematicians of ours came out with a distributed data exchange layer, which we call XRO, in which everything is connected to everything through the authentication of your identity, which basically the idea is that if your identity gives you the wall and the moat, then in most of a castle, most systems, once you breach the moat and the wall, you're in and everything is open to you. In our system, if you breach the moat and the wall, you're still stuck in a room, one person. You can get something for that one person, but you can't get the rest of the citizens. To make it work, since it's hello, hi. Can we put on that video? It's just a 3-minute video, just to give my throat a break and for a commercial break to show how our system works.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the unemployment insurance fund depends on information from the health information system. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund, so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. They can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
Now, what this does, among other things, is that in addition to security, it changes the nature of bureaucracy for the first time since it was invented 5,000 years ago, either in Mesopotamia or China. Bureaucracy has always been a parallel, kind of a serial process. If you have, especially when you want permission to do something, you apply, with a piece of paper, the paper goes to one agency, then it goes to another agency, say, about establishing business, and you have to check if all the board members pay their taxes, someone else has to check if they pay their alimony, someone else has to check if anyone's bankrupt. So it just takes quite a long time. This makes processing, bureaucratic processing parallel. And in fact, which we speeds up the establishment this in like about 15 minutes because all of those queries are answered simultaneously. The system also allows for greater transparency and reduction of corruption because basically decisions are made by checking the boxes rather than by having an official who uses his discretion to decide whether you get something that you're entitled to or not. I mean, the title is to say, if I want permission to dig a hole, I have to apply to my municipality just to make sure that there's no water main down there or there's no electrical cable. Now, in a lot of countries, if you apply, then you should get the permission, but there's an official there saying, well, it's certain, fine, whatever it is that you have to pay in currency. These kinds of decisions are made automatically. The best result, however, of this is we applied a once-only rule, which means that the government may not ask you for any information it already has. I mean, once you're identified, you no longer have to write your address down again, your telephone number, any of this stuff. But this is all, of course, done online. And this system has now been adopted from us. We give it away as foreign aid by a number of countries in this platform. It's kind of foreign aid on the phone guide. Finland, probably most prominently, we now jointly developing this. It's all open source, non-proprietary software. Mexico is adopting it. Panama is taking it over. Moldova has had it for a while. Georgia kind of, I mean, countries vary in how much they do this. Oman, we gave it to the Palestinian Authority, but they never use it. So it really depends. But again, what this does allow us to, in terms of from the point of view of the citizens, go and do things that traditionally have not happened at all. We will, as of next year, have cross-border interoperability of digital prescription. So if Finn comes to December, he gets, at 2 at a time, we get 8 million Finns a year, loses medicine, he can then call or write his doctor in North of the Arctic Circle. The doctor will then review his prescription. He will take his Finnish ID, plug it into any pharmacy, put it in his identifying number, and he will get his medicine. I proposed this 5 years ago to the Finnish president. Next year will be 6 years since I proposed it. That's how long it takes. The technology would probably, in most cases, take about 3 days. All of the, my mantra is it's political will, policies, laws, and regulations. It's taken that long to go. Furthermore, on digital security, this is what I want to do, is we have the big issue in Europe since Snowden has been privacy. Privacy, of course, is very important. I would argue this system allows far more privacy than the current system, but does require a certain degree of trust, which is why we don't have backdoors. Because if we had backdoors, we wouldn't have trust and we won't use the system. But the real issue, to my mind, is really data integrity. I may not like it if someone publishes my bank account or my blood type. If someone changes my blood type, or the record of my blood type, or if someone changes my bank account or contents, that's a disaster. So what we've done is put all citizen data, critical citizen data, health records, property records, law cases, because now they're all digital. You wouldn't want those changed. We put them all on blockchain. It's interesting that since it's all public sector, it's all on a private blockchain. Because if it's a public one, it'll take forever to work, as with Bitcoin, but it's on a private blockchain and administered by the government, which then means that you can't change these data. The other thing that we have done, which for security, in addition to all this, is that as a small nation that's been invaded about 20 times in the last 1,000 years, we do worry about our data. Actually, based on the experience of Japan, which lost about 5% of its data in Fukushima incident, we have now established a data embassy, applying the Vienna Convention on extraterritoriality of diplomatic representations. We have given our big server diplomatic status. It's in Luxembourg. There will be others. So that if we happen to have, we won't have any bad seismic events, most likely, because it's fairly calm. If I were Greece, I would certainly do something similar, right? Not a happy place for seismic events, but certainly you want to keep your data. A non-issue for the United States US is huge, you don't have to worry about, you need to keep your data in several different places. But for smaller countries, you probably do need to think about these things. All right, I will, and the final thing, at the national level of what we do is that we have a prohibition of unupdated software. All you have to do is look at WannaCry, which took down the UK's entire National Health Service because the UK, being too cheap, did not update. I guess the version of Windows they were using, Microsoft stopped updating in 2009. They made a special deal with the UK and Microsoft made a special deal to keep it up. I guess in 2013, but even that lapsed. And then this spring, 2017, you had the WannaCry ransomware, which shut down the medical system of a big European country. We can't allow it. This is, again, I think it's a fundamental issue that needs to be dealt with both in the private and the public sector, is that you cannot have legacy software. In other words, you must think of software as a operating cost, a running cost. Most companies and most countries think of software as a capital investment. Right? It's not like a car. It's not as if you bought a car 2 years ago, you don't need another one for free. You must always keep your software up to date. Or as in the Equifax case, when they were identified of a vulnerability in February, they didn't bother patching it until after they were breached. These are things that you're not going to get companies to observe that, and if governments don't observe that, you're going to have to legislate this. Certainly, in the case of Europe, the application of the new General Data Protection Regulation will force U.S. companies, at least in Europe, to worry about patching things or what happens to citizens' data, because the fine is going to be 4% of a company's revenue worldwide, which is no small thing. People may complain and moan about the regulations of the European Union. Personally, I think after tax, there's nothing you can say about that. I'm more surprised that there's been so little of a citizen that will cry on all of this than there has been. Just as there is, I'm surprised at all kinds of things, such as what happens to data in this country or in a number of European countries and its use. For example, Cambridge Analytica's use of data is bought in creating highly targeted, highly granular ads in the last election, probably also in the UK Brexit referendum. I think that these are all issues that will need to be addressed. They're political issues, they're not there yet. All right, I will now like to move on just quickly to the international part of this, which is that while I agree with Joe on the need for conventions, there's only one convention that works at this point, and that's the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. Originally, it was the Council of Europe convention, which was then acceded to by liberal democracies in the US, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Australia. They then decided to call it the Budapest Convention because it was no longer a Council of Europe thing. The problem with that convention, but which may also lead the way to thinking, is that there are all countries that are not acceded to the Budapest Convention, most prominently China, Russia, and Belarus. I don't know, I think Ukraine is somewhere in between. Ukraine until at least up till the end of the Yanukovych regime was also a primary source of all kinds of cyber crime. But rather, I direct attention to a fundamental conundrum of cybersecurity at the international level that we need to address, which is that our thinking about security since the first rock by a hominid, pre-human hominid, was thrown to kill another pre-human hominid, has been kinetic, distance-based. Force equals mass times acceleration, meters per second squared. Meters no longer matter in security these days. Distance does not matter. All of our security thinking, up till the present, has been based on the concept of distance, therefore geography. I mean, think about what is the primary security organization that we have? We were in it, but it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Countries that share all of the values of the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, such as New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Uruguay, and a whole bunch. They are not in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization simply because they're not in the North Atlantic. And all the work of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is based on things such as tank logistics, fighter range, bomber range, troop movement logistics. It's all distance-based. Today, none of this is. I mean, today, all of these threats have nothing to do with distance. Borders are breached without being noticed. On top of that, the threats, we'll take just one, APT-28, Fancy Bear, its name, good. What have they done? They've hacked the Bundestag, they've hacked the Italian Foreign Ministry, they've done all kinds of things in the Netherlands, Sweden, Ukraine, even the World Anti-Doping Agency has been hacked by just one group of probably GRU hackers. It, of course, did hack the DNC. I should point out here that David Langer at least told me that of the 126 people working at the DNC with access to the DNC server, 124 were actually using two-factor authentication. 2 were not. Guess how the DNC server got hacked. Anyway, the point is that our ways of looking at things in the digital era just have to change. That we have to think about security not in terms of geography. We have to realize that the threats can hit all over, and that perhaps what is at risk are forms of government, ways of organizing society. Certainly that's the case that we've seen, in the last year or so, with not only with attempts to derail the U.S. election, but we now know better that with the Brexit campaign, we know that in France, Emmanuel Macron's server was hacked. The French were, having learned from the DNC, were smart. They actually loaded their email server with obvious fakes, so that when they were doxxed, the doxxers published things that are so obviously fake that it disqualified virtually anything, even what was perhaps potentially embarrassing. Nonetheless, I would say that we do have to, while these individual actions might, we should learn from these individual actions and think about how we should guarantee our security in the future. And think about working together a lot. Our own experience with this was not very good. In 2007, we had, I guess from now on, every history of cyber warfare will be begin with the April-May 2007 attacks on Estonia. There were DDoS attacks, and then our systems were never breached, they were just shut off from people. At the time, NATO was loath to admit that this had been going on. Slowly, people came around and realized that this was a closet event, continuation of policy by other means, and ultimately what we've been asking for years, which was a Center of Excellence in Thailand, which produced the Thailand Manual 1 and 2, was established in my country. But even NATO took a while to get there. So the traditional model of someone breaches the border, and then there's an Article 5 decision made at the NAC. Doesn't really hold because in a cyber event you don't have problems with attribution. You don't know what the proper response is. We're just not ready for that, or have not been ready for that. But nonetheless, we see the security situation has decreased to such a level that even our democratic systems seem to be under threat, that we have to start thinking in multi-level terms. As I mentioned, we do have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. This kind of maybe gives us an idea that like-minded nations have agreed that they will work against cybercrime, will give out criminals from their territory. It's been used to great effect in a number of countries where, say, one country identifies a hacker in another country, and according to the convention, they are then extradited. We see that other areas don't work so well. As Joe mentioned, UNGA has failed. Even during the ITU discussions about 5 years ago, already then a set of like-minded countries, China, Belarus, Russia, as it were basically arguing for what would amount to censorship of the web, because their definition of security information security is not related to hacking, not strictly to hacking other people's infrastructure. It includes freedom of speech. And that's clearly something that liberal democracies are not willing to give up. So, another example of fairly successful cooperation, but also might lead to is that precisely the NATO Center in Thailand, because while it was originally open only to NATO countries, it is now open to other like-minded nations. Finland, a avowedly non-NATO member, is a member. Japan is basically has asked us, how could we join? So fine. It's a long decision-making process there. But if we are, as we've seen, threatened both at the level of infrastructure, at the level of privacy, at the level of our democratic processes, we will have to develop, at least among liberal democracies, some kind of defensive mechanisms, among them international cooperation. At this point, or until about 2 weeks ago, there has been no real cooperation within NATO. NATO's idea of cybersecurity only to deal with the security of the organization, not the members of the allies, but just the organization. Thinking is moving beyond that, but maybe it's not gone far enough. I do think that we will have to face up to the reality that liberal democracies are under threat, that the mechanisms for attacking liberal democracies are no longer merely kinetic, and that we have to start working toward some kind of serious organization for cybersecurity, for liberal democracies, that, as with the attacks, transcend geographical boundaries, so that from New Zealand and Australia to Finland and Estonia, countries will share information. it's going to be a long time. Cyber information, even within NATO, as I said, is more a matter of follows the espionage paradigm where you don't share anything, as opposed to the interoperability paradigm when you put a U.S. missile under a French Mirage jet. In that sense of interoperability. In fact, it's one of our experiences when we discovered some malware, we went to NATO and said, "Oh, look what we found," and NATO said, "Oh, you too." That's not how you do cybersecurity. So I would argue and close with that we do need, well, not quite close, we do need to think about this, but I will close with two small points. One of them is that we hear everywhere all this talk about we need backdoors. We see the Prime Minister of Australia, the Commissioner of Justice for the European Union, the Minister of Home Affairs in the UK, the US Attorney General also argue for backdoors. I don't understand that issue, frankly, why you would want to do that. Or maybe because it comes from not understanding technology. Basically, as soon as you have a backdoor, that becomes the holy grail. The holy grail for the people, because it's one-stop shopping. Why would you want to try to hack anyone if there is a hackable, and I use the term wrong, hackable key, a backdoor somewhere? And we need not think only in terms of smart people hacking the key, as which they smart people have done, and we know CIA and NSA have been hacked. But you don't even need that. I mean, the worst cases of breaches have been inside. In Scott Sagan just put out a whole collection of inside threats. But if you think about what are the worst cases, Snowden. That was not, no one breached NSA. He's an insider threat. Reality Winner, that bizarrely named woman who just gave out an NSA document on Russian attempts to hack voting machines. Again, an insider job. Now, if I said not to criticize the United States, let's say I'm in the European Union, 500 million people, the Commissioner for Justice says, okay, they guess their wish, and the wish is to have a backdoor key. Now, if I'm Vladimir Putin, or something else, I would say, okay, I don't have to hack anything. I just need the key. I can get into everything. Everything. And instead of trying to get in there through digital electronic means, I would just find out who the key master is. I give you 2 billion euros. I mean, eventually find someone who's going to fall for that. So let's stay away from backdoor keys. My point. In this regard, I should say that Estonia, which the ITU, the nefarious organization, is listed Estonia as the most secure, most secure in terms of cybersecurity country in Europe. Russia is the most secure in Eurasia, China is the most secure in Asia. The only difference is that the Freedom House is also rated Estonia as #1 in the world in Freedom Online, which disputes, I would say, the argument that you need to be repressive in order to have security and such. But ultimately, everything boils down to my mind that needs, well, it wasn't that brilliant, but the idea that was written 68 years ago, 1959, 62 years ago, I don't know, by C.P. Snow, called The Two Cultures, which I think was not nearly as relevant when it was published as it is today. C.P. Snow was a physical chemist and a literary novelist who gave the world the term the corridors of power in one of his novels. But he had this great little essay As I said, not so good essay, but here's an essay about being at the faculty dining club in this college in Cambridge, sitting with sitting with the physical chemists, the physicists, the other chemists, discussing presumably quantum mechanics. And then he would get up after dinner and go drink with the poets and the essayists and the novelists and the Shakespeare scholars. And he said that you can't, I mean, he was the only one who could move between the two tables. The poets and essayists had no clue about physics, and the physicists and chemists couldn't care less about it. And he said this is a problem of the university. I would argue that today it's a problem of society. Back then, technology did not impinge upon people's lives the way it does now. Your phone did not tell anyone where you were. You could, it was plugged into the wall. The most you had to do, the television could not look at you, despite, sort of Orwell being published already 10 years earlier, but, you didn't need to put a little thing in front of your computer to keep the computer from looking at you, listening to you. The most you interact with technology perhaps was to set the timing on your distributor cap, which is something that most people before don't know what it is. So it was a different world. Today, technology impinges upon us. Yet people do not understand the problem. The technologists do not understand the ethical, legal, moral, philosophical basis of a liberal democracy, in many cases. And the people who are responsible for the legal system do not have a clue about IT. On the one hand, right after the iPhone came out, one of the early apps, you could find out where you traveled. So I downloaded the app and I got this map of where I did. All based on the S7 protocol that says where mobile phone has been. Big fat lines where I traveled a lot, and thinner gray ones where I didn't. I showed it to a security detail. I showed it to them. We said, it got white. We said, eliminate that immediately. I said, what's the point? I mean, the data exists, right? And then again in 2014, in the fall, I went to the European Parliament. They have a 5-year term. It was half a year after their most recent election. I gave a talk about digital stuff, trying to tell them how important it is that you actually know something about it. And then as I kind of show and tell moment, I pulled out my mobile phone and I said, this thing here, you all have one. Everyone had one, of course. I said, well, your next election is in 4.5 years. That's 3 iterations of Moore's law. That means this same thing by the time of your next election will be 2 to the 3rd times more powerful. And this is audience, so members of parliament interested in IT. Someone said, what is 2 to the 3rd? Now, if this is the level of understanding on the one side by people who make laws and policies, and on the other side by the people who design and create this technology, then we have a serious problem. And so my ultimate request is that for genuine cybersecurity, what you really need is people, the policymakers and lawmakers, learning something about math and science, and the people who do all the gee whiz things that we deal with, take a course in Western philosophy. Thank you very much.
Lots of food for thought, and we've got a fair amount of time to discuss it. We have 2 points we want to do to wrap up. So, with us, privileged to honor you. General discussion. Yeah.
And Tom, I thought that was terrific. And maybe Juan can either share your note sources or video eventually, or maybe send around the New York article to the BGF attendance. Because I thought that was very helpful. But I wanted to ask you about whether you had views on the Indian system on par. Excellent service, Estonian e-government. They always couple it with, oh, but it's only 1 million people, it's easy to do at that level. The Indian Aadhaar system is over 1 billion people. And so I wondered whether, and I'm told by Indian friends that they are getting very close to that number. In other words, that it's a reality, not just a notion. Have you looked at that? Can you tell us anything about, this is the ultimate test. Can you scale something like the success of Estonia to what the UN says will be the largest country in the world in 5 years?
Well, what they have is a nominal identity. It is not a functional identity. And I actually had a long discussion about this with the who invented Aadhaar. And he said that his goal would be to make it a functional identity of the sort that we have in Estonia, but that's a long way off. On the scalability, which I think is right, is that they would start off, again, since it's a federal country, they would start off with a smaller state, and then see how it proceeds from there. If it's working, again, so much of the decision making is made at the state level, not at the national level. So that's the way to go. It's an empirical question. Mexico has adopted our system, or is in the process of adopting it, and they in fact have modified the X road because they too are a federal state. It's kind of like UBI, universal basic income. It sounds good, but you have to test it out and see if it really works. It is a mistake.
Did I miss something? What happened yesterday in Alabama?
There was a news report that the election commission in Alabama tried to shut down the DMVs in counties with population of 25% black people, and at the same time demanding driver's licenses for identification for voting.
In all of the counties that had 75% black population.
I read in passing, I said, well,
So no access if somebody wanted to go there.
Well, you can use the driver's license, require the driver's license to be a form of identification, and you can't get a driver's license because in York County, they don't have a DMV. Well, that's a unique form of voter's person.
Who's next?
Hey, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you share your software. You mentioned you open source the code, and if there are other layers of the infrastructure that you open source, and how you share that with other countries, and what kind of, for instance, blockchain application you're talking about.
I don't know how much we share, frankly. I know we did the basic platform. You should ask them. I don't know. I mean, what we do, why we give it away, is that, okay, here's a platform. You can develop it as you would like. And some countries do develop it, others don't. I know that many of the sort of lower-level services have been developed there, Oman, using basically copying the Estonian model at the lower level. But then they don't have the upper level platform for comparing. And so you still have, in that country, you have these fiefdoms. So ministries don't share different with other ministries, let alone open up to the public. But I mean, I can tell you who to ask.
Who's next? Yeah. I would like you to tell us what steps you think might be taken to engage other nations, especially those that are authoritarian, in agreeing to international norms that make cyberspace more secure. And let me prime that response by making a couple quick observations. First, about 2 years ago, the East-West Institute, with which I'm affiliated, held a conference in New York City and had a panel discussion on the Budapest Convention. And a representative of the Russian Federation, Ilya Loeb, said before the group that Russia won't sign it because of Article 32B, the transporter provision. I approached him about this afterwards, knowing that Microsoft did not want to handle emails that they have under their control in Ireland.